Forget everything you think you know about what just happened in Saudi Arabia. Let me be clear about something that officials in Washington and Riyadh are desperately hoping you will not understand. What occurred in the early hours following that carefully staged summit was not an isolated incident. It was not random terrorism. It was not the work of disorganized militants. What happened was a precisely coordinated military strike against critical Saudi infrastructure that demonstrates capabilities no one in the Western media wants to acknowledge exist. And it happened within 6 hours of the summit documents being signed. 6 hours. That is not coincidence. That is a message. A Houthi ballistic missile, specifically a Quds-4 variant with extended range modifications, struck the Ras Tanura petroleum processing facility at approximately 3:47 in the morning local time. Not a refinery in the desert, not a remote pumping station. Ras Tanura, which processes over 6 million barrels of crude oil per day and sits at the absolute heart of Saudi Arabia's energy export infrastructure. The missile penetrated Saudi air defenses, American-supplied Patriot batteries that were supposedly positioned to provide layered coverage over exactly these critical nodes, and delivered its warhead with sufficient accuracy to ignite storage tanks containing refined products awaiting export. Before dawn, secondary explosions had spread fires across a facility complex covering over 25 square kilometers. The flames were visible from commercial satellites by first light. Having spent decades in military intelligence, having served in environments where I analyzed exactly these kinds of capabilities and targeting decisions, I need you to understand what you are actually looking at here. This was not luck. This was not symbolic. This was demonstration of technical capability, operational intelligence, and most importantly, strategic calculation that fundamentally changes the security architecture of the Persian Gulf. And almost no one in positions of authority wants to say that out loud because the implications are absolutely terrifying for the way we have structured our entire regional posture. The summit that concluded just hours before this strike brought together Saudi leadership with representatives from 6 Gulf Cooperation Council states to announce what was being presented as a historic security framework. The official statements emphasized unprecedented cooperation, integrated air defense systems, intelligence sharing mechanisms, and explicitly invoked American security guarantees as the foundation of regional stability. The photographs showed handshakes. The press releases used words like ironclad and unshavable commitments. Western media coverage treated it as diplomatic progress, another step toward containing Iranian influence and building what officials keep calling a Middle Eastern NATO. Then the missiles flew. Multiple launches were detected by American early warning systems operating in the region. At least 4 projectiles were tracked on ballistic trajectories originating from Houthi-controlled territory in Yemen. 3 were reportedly intercepted by Saudi air defense batteries, though independent confirmation of successful interceptions remains limited, and the Saudis have every incentive to inflate their defensive success rates. But that 4th missile, the Quds-4 that hit Ras Tanura, it got through. And the facility that represents the single most valuable piece of petroleum infrastructure in the Saudi kingdom was burning before the summit delegates had left Riyadh. Let me walk you through exactly what the Quds-4 represents from a technical standpoint, because this matters enormously for understanding what just happened. The Quds series traces its development lineage back to Iranian Shahab and Qiyam missile programs, with substantial technical modifications implemented by Houthi forces using components and expertise provided through supply chains that Western intelligence has spent years trying to interdict without notable success. The Quds-4 specifically represents an extended range variant achieving operational reach approaching 1,500 kilometers, which places virtually every significant target in Saudi Arabia within engagement envelope, from launch positions deep in Houthi-controlled mountainous terrain in northern Yemen. The guidance package on these systems has evolved substantially over the past 3 years. Early Houthi ballistic missiles demonstrated circular error probable measurements, meaning the radius within which 50% of missiles would impact ranging from 500 to 1,000 meters. Adequate for striking large area targets like air bases or urban zones, but insufficient for precision engagement of specific facilities. The Quds-4 incorporates what intelligence assessments suggest is GPS-aided inertial guidance with possible terminal radar homing for large reflective targets, reducing CEP to approximately 50 to 100 meters. That level of accuracy transforms the weapon system from a terror weapon into a genuine precision strike capability against point targets like processing facilities, power generation stations, or desalination plants. The warhead configuration on the variant that struck Ras Tanura almost certainly utilized a penetrating fuse designed to detonate after initial impact rather than on contact, maximizing the probability of breaching containment structures and igniting stored hydrocarbons. The explosive payload itself ranges between 500 and 750 kilograms of high explosive, depending on specific variant and range optimization, which provides sufficient energy to rupture storage tanks, sever pipelines, and initiate cascading secondary explosions in densely configured petroleum infrastructure, where one ignition source can rapidly propagate across connected systems. Stay with me because what I am about to tell you about the targeting logic here reveals strategic calculations that should deeply concern anyone who thinks they understand Middle Eastern security dynamics. Ras Tanura was not chosen because it was convenient or because it was the only target within range. The Houthis, and by extension their Iranian technical advisors and intelligence sources, had dozens of potential targets across Saudi Arabia that could have been struck with similar probability of penetrating air defenses. They chose Ras Tanura specifically because of what it represents economically and symbolically. Economically, Ras Tanura processes roughly 8% of global oil exports on a given day. Damage to the facility does not just affect Saudi revenue streams. It immediately impacts global petroleum markets, insurance rates for Gulf shipping, and the risk calculations of every international energy company with operations in the region. The strike occurred during a period when global oil markets were already experiencing price volatility due to production decisions and demand uncertainty. Adding a demonstrated threat to critical Saudi infrastructure creates an immediate risk premium that translates to billions of dollars in market capitalization shifts within hours. But the symbolic dimension matters even more than the economic one. This strike happened within 6 hours of a summit explicitly designed to project strength and coordination among Gulf Arab states backed by American security guarantees. The message embedded in that timing is absolutely unambiguous. All of your air defenses, all of your American support, all of your coordinated frameworks cannot protect you from precision strikes against your most valuable economic assets. That message was not directed primarily at Saudi Arabia. It was directed at every other Gulf state that might be considering deeper integration with American regional security architecture or normalization with Israel. It was a demonstration that Iranian-aligned forces can impose costs that no defensive system can fully mitigate. Here is what actually happened in those critical hours that no official briefing is going to address honestly. Saudi air defense operators detected the launches immediately. American early warning radar operating from bases in the region provided tracking data within seconds. The launches were assessed as ballistic threats following trajectories consistent with targeting critical infrastructure in the eastern province where the vast majority of Saudi petroleum facilities concentrate. Patriot batteries were cued to intercept, but here is where the technical realities that no one wants to discuss become absolutely critical. Patriot systems were designed during the Cold War to intercept aircraft and later evolved to engage tactical ballistic missiles like Iraqi Scuds during the 1991 Gulf War. They were not optimized for engaging the kinds of threats they now face in the Middle East. The engagement envelope, meaning the range and altitude parameters within which the system can successfully prosecute targets, creates gaps that sophisticated adversaries understand how to exploit. The radar cross-section and flight profile of modern short-range ballistic missiles, particularly those using depressed trajectories or maneuvering warheads, present challenges that Patriot batteries struggle to address consistently. When you examine the actual performance data from Patriot systems defending Saudi Arabia over the past 5 years, the picture looks very different from official success rate claims. During the sustained Houthi campaign against Saudi targets beginning in 2019, independent analysis of video evidence, satellite imagery of impact sites, and pattern analysis of claimed versus confirmed interceptions suggests that actual success rates fall somewhere between 30 and 50% against these types of threats. Saudi officials claim much higher rates, above 85%, but those claims rely on counting any interceptor launch as a success rather than requiring confirmed destruction of the incoming threat. So, when 4 missiles were launched targeting Saudi infrastructure and the Saudis claim 3 were intercepted, the baseline probability suggests that 1 to 2 missiles actually got through air defenses. We know for certain that at least one did because Ras Tanura was burning, but there may well have been additional impacts at other facilities that did not generate the same level of visible damage or that Saudi authorities have not publicly acknowledged, because doing so would further undermine the security narrative they are desperately trying to maintain. Keep watching, because the next part is where everything starts to unravel in terms of what this means for the entire regional security architecture that American policy has been built on for decades. The Saudi kingdom has spent over $80 billion on air defense systems over the past 15 years. They operate multiple overlapping layers, including Patriot batteries for high-altitude interception, THAAD systems theoretically providing terminal phase defense against ballistic threats, and shorter-range systems like Skyguard and Shaheen covering lower-altitude approaches. This represents one of the most expensive integrated air defense networks ever constructed by any nation outside the major powers. And a missile that probably cost less than $2 million to produce, launched from territory that the Saudis do not control, penetrated that entire defensive architecture and struck the single most valuable piece of economic infrastructure in the kingdom. The cost-exchange ratio here is almost incomprehensible. Every time the Houthis launch a salvo of 4 missiles, even if 3 are intercepted, the Saudis expend somewhere between $12 million and $20 million in interceptor missiles alone, not counting the operational costs of maintaining the defensive systems, the intelligence overhead required for early warning, or the economic disruption from shutting down airspace during engagements. And if just 1 missile in 4 gets through and hits a meaningful target, the damage costs and market impacts can easily reach into the billions. This is not sustainable. And everyone involved in planning Middle Eastern security policy understands that it is not sustainable. But no one wants to say that publicly, because the implications force a complete reassessment of whether the current approach has any viability whatsoever. If Saudi Arabia, with unlimited funding and complete American support, cannot protect its critical infrastructure from missile attacks launched by what is nominally a non-state actor operating from one of the poorest countries in the region, then what exactly is the American security guarantee worth? What does it mean when officials talk about ironclad commitments to defend partners against external aggression? Let me tell you what this really means in terms of strategic calculations that are happening right now in capitals across the Middle East. Every Gulf Arab state that watched this strike is reassessing their own vulnerability. The United Arab Emirates operates similar critical infrastructure concentrated in relatively small geographic areas. Kuwait's oil facilities are even more concentrated than Saudi Arabia's. Qatar's liquefied natural gas export facilities represent virtually its entire economic foundation and sit exposed on the coast within easy range of Iranian missiles or proxy forces. Bahrain hosts the United States Fifth Fleet headquarters on an island that offers essentially zero strategic depth against missile attack. All of these states have spent the past decade being told that integration with American security architecture, procurement of American defense systems, and coordination through frameworks like the one just announced at the summit would provide protection against Iranian aggression or proxy attacks. And within 6 hours of the latest iteration of that framework being formally adopted, a critical Saudi facility was burning after a successful missile strike. The credibility damage to the entire American regional security posture is absolutely catastrophic, even if no official statement is ever going to acknowledge that reality directly. Now, let me walk you through what happens next because the consequences are already cascading through multiple levels of regional dynamics. First, at the immediate tactical level, Saudi Arabia is going to be forced to divert substantial additional resources to protecting critical infrastructure. This likely means deploying additional air defense batteries around key facilities, which spreads the existing defensive network even thinner and creates new gaps that adversaries will identify and exploit. It probably means increasing investment in passive defense measures like hardening structures, dispersing operations, and building redundancy into critical systems, all of which impose enormous costs without addressing the fundamental vulnerability. Second, at the regional level, every Gulf state is now having conversations about whether continuing confrontation with Iran and its proxies makes strategic sense given the demonstrated inability to defend against the kinds of asymmetric attacks that Iran has proven it can coordinate. There will be quiet diplomatic feelers extended, back-channel communications reactivated, and assessments made about whether accommodation with Iranian interests might provide better security than continued reliance on American defensive systems that keep failing at critical moments. This directly undermines American strategy for the region, which depends on maintaining unified Gulf Arab opposition to Iranian influence. Third, at the great power level, this attack demonstrates to China and Russia that American security guarantees in critical regions are not functioning as advertised. Both powers have been working to expand their influence in the Middle East by offering alternatives to American partnership. When Saudi Arabia cannot protect its own core economic interests despite hosting American forces and operating American equipment under American coordination, that creates an opening for competitors to offer different approaches. We should expect to see accelerated Chinese engagement with Gulf states around security cooperation and Russian offers of air defense systems as alternatives to failed American platforms. Fourth, at the global economic level, the successful strike against Ras Tanura forces a reassessment of risk for every international company operating in the Gulf petroleum sector. Insurance rates for facilities and shipping are going to increase. Investment decisions are going to factor in higher probability of disruptive attacks. Long-term planning is going to account for the reality that critical infrastructure in the region exists under credible threat that existing defensive measures cannot reliably counter. This introduces friction into global energy markets that will persist regardless of whether additional attacks actually occur, because the demonstrated capability changes baseline risk calculations. But if you thought that was alarming, stay with me, because what I have not yet told you is where this truly becomes dangerous for stability in a region that supplies roughly 30% of global oil demand. The successful strike against Ras Tanura establishes a precedent that other Iranian-aligned actors across the region are going to study and potentially replicate. Hezbollah in Lebanon possesses vastly larger and more sophisticated missile arsenals than the Houthis, with precision-guided munitions capable of striking specific buildings in Tel Aviv from launch positions in southern Lebanon. Iraqi militia groups aligned with Iran operate within artillery range of American bases and critical infrastructure in Iraq and could extend their targeting to include facilities in Kuwait or Saudi Arabia's northern oil fields. If the pattern established by the Houthis against Saudi Arabia becomes the model for how Iranian proxies across the region engage in future conflicts, we are looking at a situation where virtually every critical facility in every Gulf state exists under credible missile threat with no reliable defensive counter. The entire economic foundation of the modern Middle East, the petroleum infrastructure that took decades and trillions of dollars to construct, becomes a hostage to Iranian strategic calculations. That is not a theoretical future scenario. That is the demonstrated reality that just played out at Ras Tanura. I am not offering predictions with certainty here because the situation remains extremely fluid and decisions being made in the coming days by leadership in Riyadh, Washington, Tehran, and other regional capitals will determine which trajectory we follow. But I am obligated to tell you the truth as I see it based on decades of analyzing these kinds of situations. The current American approach to Middle Eastern security, which depends on expensive defensive systems protecting vulnerable infrastructure while attempting to maintain confrontational posture toward Iran, has been demonstrated to be fundamentally inadequate. Not inadequate at the margins, not inadequate in specific circumstances, fundamentally inadequate at its core premise. The strike that occurred in those early morning hours after the summit was not an ending. It was an opening move in what could become a sustained campaign, demonstrating that no amount of spending on American defense systems can protect the Gulf Arab states from the kinds of asymmetric attacks that Iran and its proxies have refined over 2 decades of conflict experience. Every official statement about ironclad security guarantees and unprecedented cooperation and integrated defense networks has to be measured against the reality of flames rising from Ras Tanura while the ink was still drying on summit documents promising exactly the protection that failed. What happened in Saudi Arabia is not just about Saudi Arabia. It is about the viability of the entire strategic framework that has governed American engagement with the Middle East for the past 30 years. That framework assumed that overwhelming conventional military superiority and advanced defensive technology could deter adversaries and protect partners. What we are seeing demonstrated repeatedly from the Abqaiq attack in 2019 to the Ras Tanura strike is that those assumptions were wrong. And until officials in Washington acknowledge that they were wrong and begin developing strategy based on accurate rather than preferred assessments of regional military balance, we are going to continue seeing critical failures that undermine both American credibility and the security of partners who depend on American commitments. The decisions being made right now as we speak in secure conference rooms in Riyadh and Washington are going to determine whether this situation escalates toward broader regional conflict or whether there is finally acknowledgement that the current approach has failed and alternatives need to be seriously considered. I have been wrong before and will be wrong again about specific predictions, but the fundamental assessment here is based on observable reality rather than speculation. The Houthis demonstrated they can strike critical Saudi infrastructure despite integrated air defenses. That capability is not going away. The strategic calculations it enables are not going away. And the consequences for regional stability are going to echo through every security decision made in the Middle East for years to come. Keep watching developments closely because what happens in the coming days and weeks will reveal whether leadership across the region learned the actual lessons from what just occurred or whether we are going to see continued doubling down on approaches that have already proven inadequate. The flames at Ras Tanura are still burning as I record this. The question is whether they represent an isolated incident that gets managed and forgotten, or whether they represent the beginning of a fundamental shift in how security and vulnerability are understood across the entire Middle East. Based on everything I know about the capabilities that were just demonstrated and the strategic calculations driving Iranian and proxy behavior, I believe we are looking at the latter. And that should concern everyone who cares about stability in a region that remains absolutely central to global economic function.